Hello everyone, I'm Jenny Dodd. I'm the CEO of TAFE Directors Australia. Welcome to this afternoon, this afternoon for me, maybe this morning for some of you, TAFE Talks on the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. In the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to begin today's seminar by paying my respects to elders past and present. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal people, which is in Canberra. And I pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present with us today and to emerging leaders. And we are from all many lands, so you may like to acknowledge where you are coming from in this seminar as well. Today's seminar, I'm just going to say a couple of logistics firstly. If you have a question, please place it into the Q&A. You'll also note in the chat that our TAFE panelists have their email addresses will be there if you want to contact them after. So we'll use the chat for information. We'll use the Q&A if we can, if you're all comfortable with that, to actually make sure that we're capturing your questions. But if you make a mistake, doesn't matter. One of the TDA Secretariat staff who are on this webinar today will pick up your question and pop it into the Q&A. So let's begin by really welcoming and thanking our four speakers today. Firstly, I'm going to introduce them all because today's seminar is a flow of conversation as a panel session, not individual presentations. So we'll move through our presentations by various people, by me directing questions to various of our four speakers. Can I firstly welcome our guest, our non-TAFE guest today, Professor Sally Kift. Sally Kift is a Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy and a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Law and President of the Australian Learning and Teaching Fellows. She's a renowned higher education expert and academic and has published widely on transition pedagogy. For those of you who subscribe to Campus Review, and you know that Sally is a regular participant in there as well. Campus Morning Mail, my apologies. Sally was a member of the Australian Qualifications Framework Review Panel that reported to the government in September 2019, of which those recommendations are now going through their next iteration of where they'll be adopted and how they'll be adopted. I first met Sally when I was in TAFE Queensland, and she was on our advisory committee for our higher education environment. That leads me to introduce Vanessa Crawford, who's the Associate Dean Higher Education at TAFE Queensland. Vanessa is responsible for quality assurance of higher education courses and leads the scholarship reporting processes. She has held several leadership positions in secondary schools in her early career and in higher education for the last decade. And Vanessa chairs the TDA TAFE Higher Education Provider Network, which has actually been in place for a very long time, well over a decade. And it's been a vital network in terms of helping TAFEs who deliver in the higher education environment to make sure that they're working together and have some avenues for conversations and quality. I now turn to our two Victorian speakers and firstly welcome Associate Professor Melanie Williams. Melanie is Associate Dean Scholarship at William Angliss Institute, where her primary role is to lead and support vocational and higher education teaching staff in taking a scholarly approach to improving their learning and teaching practice. Melanie has worked in academic development in vet and higher education for over 25 years, including as a private consultant. Her research interests include the scholarship of learning, teaching and engagement, transformative learning, personal epistemology and scenario planning, a practice of long-term futures research. We also welcome Dr. Fiona Varr. Fiona is a senior lecturer and leads the Scholarship and Applied Research Unit at Melbourne Polytechnic, driving the development of Melbourne Polytechnic Scholarship Framework. Her professional and research background in educational change, academic development and quality enhancement ensures this work has a program enhancement focus, systematically values scholarship capability and promotes a vibrant scholarship culture. So thank you today to our four speakers for being with us, and thank you for participating in this flow of conversation. So let's begin. TEXA's guidance notes on scholarship define scholarship as those activities concerned with gaining new and improved understanding, or appreciation and insights into a field of knowledge, or engaging with and keeping up to date with advances in the field. I'm going to firstly ask our guest, Sally Kift, to make some comments. So Sally, we're really delighted you could join us today. Can I ask you, from your background in higher education, what are the key points you would make about that guidance note?
So thank you for having me today, Jenny, and it's a delight to join TAFE colleagues, old and new, and I hope I can contribute to the conversation. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and extend those respects to Indigenous colleagues in the room today. And I see you have quite the number of colleagues generally in the room. So I suppose the point I would make about the guidance note is that it is a guidance note. The Higher Education Standards Framework and the TEXA Act provide the definitive definitions and references in relation to scholarship. But the guidance note in May 22, when it was released, is the result of extensive consultation over, I think, at least a couple of years. So I think that's a very helpful piece of advice from TEXA and from the sector more broadly about it. The guidance note, and we're going to come to the definitions in a moment, I think, but more broadly, I think the guidance note is particularly helpful because it clarifies some matters more broadly, specifically in the context of our discussion today, that engagement in scholarship can be considered at two levels, at the provider level, but also at the individual staff member level. And it also makes clear that the provider's context is relevant, and including particularly that the provider makes a systematic approach to organising the scholarship, which includes incorporating corporate and academic governance analysis and oversight of what's happening there. It provides a number of examples of what is and isn't scholarships. I think that's very helpful. And it reinforces and draws back to the Higher Education Standards Framework by saying that scholarship is particularly relevant to course design and staff capability. And when you look at the provider category standards, the concept of scholarship is absolutely essential to a higher education provider, whatever the category. And they talk in terms of systematic support for scholarship and demonstrating scholarly activities and outcomes that inform teaching, learning and professional practice and make a contribution to the advancement and dissemination of knowledge. So it is, we are educational institutions, and part of our educational remit is advancing practice.
Thanks, Sally. I think that that's a good sort of oversight as to how we're going to structure today's conversation, because we're going to talk about the scholarship of teaching and learning, and then we're going to move to scholarly activity. In layman's terms, do you want to just define what does the scholarship of teaching and learning mean?
Yes, well, so and thank you for taking us to the definition from the guidance note, which you might or might not find of assistance. I suppose when I first started with the scholarship of teaching and learning, and I should make clear that unlike vocational education, higher education teachers are not required to do something such as a Certificate 4 in training and assessment. So we just come in with our expert discipline knowledge, apparently. My expert discipline knowledge used to be in law. I'm not quite sure what it is anymore. So I just came to law teaching, and then because it was my day job, actually wanted to understand a little bit more about what that might have entailed. If I'd known about the Certificate 4, perhaps I might have done that at the time. But what helped me was my finding work from the US, and it matters, I suppose, in the sense that Lee Shulman, I would lie down and just learn from him endlessly. But he talked about teaching as community property, as teaching is not a private individual activity. Teaching is something that you make public, that shouldn't be hidden, that you should be available for examination and critique, and you present in a form on which others can build. So when you think about that, it's our examined day job, our examined practice. And I think that what might be a little bit hidden in the guidance note, I mean, it's there, is there's two particular aspects to scholarship. You would have to be contemporary and current in your field of expertise. And of course, I think that would be where we would all situate ourselves. But also, you are now a teacher. So you have to be contemporary and current in modern learning and teaching innovation and practice. So what used to pass as potential practice back in the day, and I might be talking more in higher education than vocational education, has advanced significantly. We now talk about learning outcomes, you talk about competencies, we understand constructive alignment, that learning and teaching approaches are aligned to the teaching activities and the assessment approaches. And more recently, for example, we've got very interested in academic integrity, particularly in the context of contract cheating. So the expectation is that scholarly teachers engage in the scholarship of learning and teaching, both in their practice for their discipline and also for learning and teaching, and need to be contemporary and up to date in that. And TEXA provides a range of examples of the sorts of things, which goes back to Lee Schulman's definition about the need to make it public and available for critique and in a form on which others can build. So TEXA talks about journal publications, conference proceedings. What we, the four of us, are doing here, five of us, I'm sorry, are doing here, that would be a scholarly output for us, not so much necessarily for attendees, because they're engaging in the advancement of practice. But then if in turn they went back to their own institutions and and facilitated a discussion and advanced practice in that way, then that would be an example of scholarship. So it's perhaps a little bit confusing when we first come to it, but I think when you think about it as your examined practice and the need to be contemporary in both the discipline and learning and teaching, I think it's somewhat easier to understand.
Sally, I like that. It's a community property, and you're quite right. For the five of us who've been preparing for this session, we've had a lot of backwards and forwards, a lot of teasing out of ideas and then coming to the final product for today. So thank you. So one last focus now in terms of our next focus now, just for Sally, just before we move to our first TAFE speaker, is can you elaborate in the context of our audience here are generally non-university higher education providers and therefore not research intensive universities. From what you've just said, which was very rich information, what should be their focus?
Well, so I was trying to think again about how to make this sort of more relevant in the constructivist, which is a teaching philosophy way. So, we start where people are, and in a constructivist way, which is the philosophy of learning and teaching, we try to build on that both for our students and in all our discussions. I suppose when you think about the current world of future work and the need to constantly up and reskill, I mean, that's, if I'm attempting to try and make it real and relevant, it's not some esoteric regulatory imposed imperative to do weird, unmeaningful stuff. It is very much about the need for us to be constantly iterating, not just in our discipline practice, but also in what we do. So I mentioned the academic integrity responses to contract cheating. It would be negligent and inappropriate of us to not engage with scholarly and scholarship practices that didn't take account of advances in that regard. And as we apply them in our own disciplines, and we talk in convoluted terms, I'm sorry, about pedagogical content knowledge, which is just the idea that there is a philosophy of teaching that applies to each discipline. So what I might do in law and talk about case notes and mooting and a range of other things has no relevance whatsoever to nursing colleagues or hospitality colleagues who have their own pedagogical practices, deeply entrenched in signature pedagogies for those disciplines. So if we think about how we continue to iteratively advance that, how we apply advances in learning and teaching to our own students, to our own contexts, as we upskill and reskill, and how that is examined. So we think about evaluating our new teaching innovations and practices as we develop them and apply them and constantly iterate.
Thank you. So thank you, Sally. Now, we're now going to turn to our TAFE panellists. I want to give each panellist an opportunity to outline the key features of the model that they've introduced in their respective TAFE organisations. We're going to start with Fiona. Fiona, you have recently introduced a revised scholarship model at Melbourne Polytechnic. Your focus has been on rigorous scholarship that leads to program quality enhancement. Would you please share with your audience some key features of your model, please?
Thanks, Jenny. Hello, everyone. Yes, we introduced a new policy in 2021, and we're well into the implementation of that. And the approach that we're using, we're trying to actually really address very thoughtfully around a range of stakeholders. So obviously, the Scholarship of Learning and Teaching supports student outcomes, so that's very important to us. We're also very mindful of the TEXA standards, especially in terms of curriculum teaching, staff capability and currency. For academics, it's really important for us to support them and to offer them the recognition of quality scholarship in a range of different forms. So that's what our system needed to provide. And then very much it all comes together with a program focus where we're actually identifying areas that need for improvement based on a sort of the quality cycle of improvement. So we're seeing scholarship very much as an opportunity, as an enabler of improved quality to what we offer at Melbourne Polytechnic. So what we've got is we have a definition of scholarship which is principle-based, and so it actually incorporates a whole range of different activities that people can participate in, that as long as it meets the definition, it'll count as scholarship. So that can include traditional research, non-traditional research outputs, program development if conducted in a scholarly way, and benchmarking, for instance. So as long as the principles that we've identified for scholarship in our definition are met, then we encourage people to record that and we'll sort of register that as scholarship. But what's really important to really support the points that Sally was making around enhancing learning and teaching and bringing in those innovations and keeping it modern, is each program at Melbourne Polytechnic has developed a set of program scholarship objectives. So this is where the program, people involved in ensuring we've got quality programs, will actually look at what we need to be addressing in a given program area, and identify ways to that scholarship can help us achieve improvement in those areas. So they're called our program scholarship objectives. They're developed and by the program team, but also then through our governance, they're approved that way. And so they sort of set the framework for individual program work, and then individual academics, when it comes to working out their scholarship, what they'll actually be doing in a given year, they use those as a sort of guide for their work plan in terms of scholarship. So, and the program scholarship, I've just made the point, the program scholarship, we link them back to recognising the standards. So we're trying to really join all those dots together, where we've got the standards, we've got an intention to improve, link it to quality, and what academics actually do. And then there's we also want to review on that basis as well. So that's our system. Yeah.
That sounds very structured, Fiona. Thank you very much for that outline. I'll leave Sally in a minute to make some observations. I'm going to ask, before we get there though, Melanie. Melanie, you're also a non-university higher education provider in Melbourne, William Angliss Institute. For those on our audience today, you may or may not be aware, if you don't come from Victoria, that William Angliss Institute is an industry specialist in TAFE. That is, it specialises in food, tourism, hospitality, events and hotel management. And What that has meant from William Angliss is that they have a vertical approach to their courses. It has for many years offered both vocational education and degrees across that somewhat narrower scope of registration from other TAFEs. So Melanie, it's also, William Angliss is also an example of excellence, and I am going to congratulate you once again. In 2021, you were awarded the Large Registered Training Provider of the Year for Australia. So well done, William Angliss people. With that accolade, Melanie, please share how at William Angliss you have defined the scholarship of teaching and learning. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks for those warm wishes again. Okay, so at William Angliss, we make a distinction between scholarship and research, partly because they have separate workload allocations within our EBA. So when we talk about scholarship, it's very much about the scholarship of learning and teaching. So we have a definition of scholarship, and that is the practice of taking a planned, rigorous and reflective approach to investigating an aspect of practice and using the results to inform and improve learning and teaching. Now, that aspect of practice may be in the industry discipline area, or it may be teaching practice. But other activities such as research or quality improvement activities or course development activities, they may be counted as scholarship if they are extended through being implemented in the classroom and their impact on student learning is evaluated and the results are disseminated publicly.
Thank you. We're going to now turn to the northern part of Australia. TAFE Queensland is one of Australia's largest TAFEs and offers both its own higher education qualifications along with partnering with universities. Vanessa, in terms of your scholarship model, what are the critical areas that are critical for you?
Thanks, Jenny. And I always think it's great to hear what other institutions are doing because it really does help to showcase the levels of expertise that exist in the non-university sector, which is often unnoticed. TAFE Queensland's scholarship model is still evolving, and it's good to hear that there's been recent evolutions in the other panellist institutions as well. Our strategy isn't dissimilar to Melbourne Polytechnic and William Angliss, to be honest. The elements that we find critical are really based around the diversity we have in our own structure. As mentioned already, we do have our own higher education courses. We also have partnerships with universities. So our staff deliver in those courses on our campuses, and that also includes creative industries. Probably the first critical element of any model that we're looking at through its evolution is certainly providing the opportunity, support and guidance to our educators. And that includes recognising and valuing the different outputs. And it's already been mentioned, you know, the non-traditional research such as in the creative industries. Our higher education delivery staff do have a weekly scholarship allocation in their workload. And that's to help recognise the importance of scholarship in informing teaching and learning. A model that articulates the difference between professional development and scholarship is important. And that includes expectations of active and regular engagement in scholarship activity, and one that is aligned to our existing internal processes for annual professional planning and development. We think that's a key to encouraging some of those more meaningful conversations between managers and academics. We also have numerous research active educators. As most people would appreciate, they largely fund their own research activities, which does increase the challenges for those staff in the non-university teaching intensive institutes that don't get that research funding. A model that also provides opportunities to showcase and celebrate the research helps to, I guess, cultivate our culture of scholarship. Opportunities we recognise do need to be provided at all levels of the institution, so within disciplines, interdisciplinary, and certainly as we expand our offerings across our regions. We acknowledge that things like hallway conversations right through to annual symposiums must be supported, as they can all inform teaching and learning practices at some level. Certainly our engagement with our university partners is also part of our scholarship model. There is a shared responsibility between those partners. So we're seeing more and more cross-institutional collaborations where our staff and university partner staff are crossing states to share in some of those symposiums and scholarship events. We are increasing our support for educators to try and help them identify their individual needs and requirements for scholarship, and also enhance their, I guess, individual accountability for both engagement in and reporting of scholarly activities. And probably the second critical element we see is the reporting processes as part of the model. We do have internal processes for reporting. They can be complex, as large organisations tend to find. But we find the reporting processes are important because it does help, I guess, complete that loop on building and maintaining the culture of scholarship at our institution. So the reporting really is considered to be just as important as the doing, and well beyond any compliance requirements. So that's a bit of a brief summary on the vision and direction that we're moving in. So I hope that's helpful. So back to you, Jenny.
Thanks, Vanessa. Now over to Sally. You've heard three models, lots of similarities, but also some distinctions. So what would you like to comment on from our previous three speakers? Thanks, Sally.
So thank you for that, Jenny, and thank you to Fiona, Melanie and Vanessa for taking us through their approaches. When you look at the guidance note, you'll see many of the things that Texas says it will look for in the scholarship approaches of providers and as individuals interpret them in those three models. I think what you specifically see is that each model is tailored to the context of the particular provider, which is important because it has to be meaningful, I think, to both the provider and its staff. And I also get a strong sense that approaches are maturing. So there's an emphasis on maturing capability, both from a provider perspective, but also for the individual staff involved. And Vanessa's idea about partnering with their partner universities and leveraging those scholarship opportunities seems very sensible and quite clever with respect. I think both can learn. There is no privileging of which scholarship is to be preferred. I think what each very much demonstrates is a very systematic approach to organising scholarship in the provider context, which again is something that Texas says that it will look for. And of course, if it's not systematised and it's not embedded in culture, so that's probably to be expected. The articulation of frameworks, I think, is very important, and the investment in Fiona's idea around the program scholarship objectives, I think that's a great innovation and makes it real and authentic to the particular discipline, which is the context in which you do your pedagogical content knowledge development. The idea that academics might develop strategies for scholarship and workplace, and we all call them different things, don't we? But professional planning and development or workplace development or whatever. I think that's important because it's as much that mentoring conversation between academic supervisor and staff member that needs to be encouraged. And I think I'd understood that a scholarly activity handbook was being developed in TAFE Queensland, so that distinguishes scholarship from professional development, which is probably an interesting early distinction to be made. And then I think we can start to blend them back together again. So what you're seeing is frameworks, data being collected and reported on, and then the evidence of impact is actively interrogated. It's going through corporate and academic governance processes. The approaches are monitored and reviewed in that way, which again is something that's important. And the systematic recognition and support for individuals in that framework, I think, in all those frameworks is quite critical. So great examples all. I wonder whether my higher education colleagues might have some trouble articulating with such clarity what their scholarship approaches were, because it's assumed to be embedded. And I suppose I should have said at the beginning, Jenny, that the reason that the word scholarship is chosen, it goes right back to, and you don't really need to remember this, but Boyer articulated 4 different types of scholarship. And it was because the big discipline research, heavy investigation piece had really taken over institutions, and there was attempted to be a bit of a rebalancing. So Boyer articulated, and that's where we've come from, 4 different types of scholarship. The scholarship of discovery, which is the big research that I think, which is saving the world from COVID and things of that nature. The scholarship of teaching and learning, which is a lot of what we're talking about today. The scholarship of application, which is particularly important in the TAFE context, of course, and more so in higher education and with the skills agenda more broadly. And then the scholarship of integration, where you bring all of those together. So that's how we get to the word scholarship, and that's why we're talking about scholarship rather than research, because it's more inclusive, and I think it's particularly helpful in the TAFE environments, and you've seen those play out there.
That was fabulous. Thank you. Thank you for that oversight of Boyer's work as well, Sally. That was really, really very useful. We're now going to turn to a little bit of a discussion around scholarly activity. I'm going to start first with Melanie. Melanie, I understand that your model of scholarship embeds individual accountability for producing high quality scholarly outputs. Can you tell us a bit more, please?
Sure. All our higher ed academic staff have a minimum allocation of 5% of their workload dedicated to scholarship. And non-research active staff may nominate up to 15% of their workload to scholarship. So all of our staff produce a 3-year scholarship strategy that outlines what it is that they're going to investigate, what aspect of practice they want to investigate, and what outputs that they'll produce. So for each 5% allocation, staff are expected to generate 1 scholarly output per year. And there's a bit of a hierarchy of outputs, I suppose. They could be internal or external presentations, could be grade publications through to a full academic publication, journal articles, book chapters, that kind of thing. We encourage people to use the 3 years to be able to produce a substantial piece of scholarship rather than, small pieces in a year. After all, 5% of a workload is only not even 12 days. But over 3 years, that is, time enough to produce a high quality journal article or something similar, if that's the way people want to go. And this accountability is monitored through the performance management system at an individual level, but it's also reported up through our academic governance committees. And it ties in, there's an overarching strategy for the scholarship of learning and teaching, which is a component piece of our even larger strategy around educational excellence. It's all around our teaching and learning, and that as well ties into our strategic plan. So again, we've got individual accountability and institutional accountability monitored through our governance systems.
Thanks. That's some very useful, I guess, tips, for want of a better word, to others participating today, and how to really put some practical components around that. You also, when we were preparing for this, talked about impact reporting. Is there anything extra you'd like to say there? Melanie,
yes, so in addition to producing annual outputs, scholarly outputs, we also ask staff to report the impact of their scholarship. So we've adapted the idea from Tilly Hinton's Impel ladder, which evaluates impact in terms of ever widening circles of influence. We use just 4 levels of impact: changes to the academic's own or their team thinking, changes to their teaching practice, then benefits to the student's learning experience, and contributions to knowledge in the field. so that each year the academics submit a report that analyses impact in those terms, and we also ask them to include evidence for each claim. So it might be things like, student feedback and attendance. It might be improvements in perhaps cohort average quiz grades or completion rate of discussion posts, that kind of thing. It might also be quite qualitative data in terms of observation notes that teachers take about changes in the quality of discussion in their classes, or that kind of thing as well. So we just ask people that they have, as well as taking the time to analyse what that impact is at those various levels, that they actually have some evidence that they can cite to back that up.
That's very interesting. Sally, any comments there?
So, so what I take particularly from that, and I do this with respect and love always, is the importance of embedding, because it's so important, isn't it? This isn't an added, this isn't ad hoc add-ons or embellishments or some weird regulatory thing that we're paying lip service to. This is core educational business. It becomes enmeshed in the institutional culture, in business as usual, and it's sort of wherever it's inescapable. Wherever you go, wherever you look, there's this culture of practice, examining practice, investigating, iterating, and enhancing, and then disseminating that, which is the core of scholarship, which is probably what distinguishes it from other professional development activity, which you do for internal purposes, more broadly, if that might be said.
Thank you. Fiona, you also talked about impact reporting. What did you mean when you were talking about impact reporting?
Yeah, so very similar in the ways that Melanie and Sally have just reported, but what we're really focusing on two levels. So individual scholarly activity, academics are asked to indicate how they believe that there's been an impact being made. And we also put that into our planning as well. So when staff want to set out their work plan for a given year, for them to consider what would be a measure of the impact that this scholarly activity is trying to achieve. And so that helps them in framing their methodology around what they're doing. And then they've also got that as a point of reference to review against later. So that's at the individual activity level. We also are considering, with the program scholarship objectives, when a program team identify an area that they want scholarship to contribute to. So there's the overarching goal there of what would it be. So, for example, one of the program scholarship objectives for one of our programs is to increase student engagement in their learning. So and there's a quality piece there. Why are we focusing on that? Why is it a priority? And then there's how are they going to understand whether we're achieving that objective through scholarship. So that would be, in this particular case, looking at actually doing the activities and reviewing against them, but also looking more broadly at say overall SEQ results and things like that. So seeing whether we're trending in a positive direction in relation to engagement. So we're actually having that conversation at program level too. What are the sort of impacts that our scholarship should be achieving, or ideally would be achieving in practice?
Thanks for that practical example. And you may have answered this, but if you would like to elaborate further, please do. You talked earlier about your program-focused quality cycle. Is there anything you'd like to say additional about where scholarly activity fits within that model?
Well, it's integral. It's all very integrated, and I think that goes to that point Sally made before about embedding. So we're very much seeing scholarship as an additional lever for our program quality. So by thinking about it and also then putting the scholarly rigor over that in terms of planning, methodology, looking at, that's through our definition, which asks us to, you're drawing on a scholarly body of work already, you've got an appropriate methodology, you're finding out, you're getting some findings, an evaluation, and then, you're presenting it for peer review in some form. And that could be through, internal peer review, but we're being transparent. Again, going back to the original point that we're actually making it a public statement around what we do and what we're aiming to do and how we understand the work. So keeping that conversation really, really close and active to what people do in their everyday. Yeah.
Thank you. That's back to Sally's opening, isn't it, really, which talked about being its community property. So thanks. Thank you, Fiona. Fiona, one last question for you before we get Sally to do some further reflection is we all in every one of our institutions, I think this makes no difference whether you're a TAFE or a university really, we have both permanent or tenured staff or those who are with us a lot, and then we have casual staff. How do you make sure your casual staff are involved in this process?
Yes, so as we all know, we're very reliant on our sessional teaching teams, and we really want them to, they're a big part of our team. So we want them, their scholarship is really going to be contributing to what we're doing. So we need to try and support them, and also if we can, and I know that's a challenge across the board. But I think what our model does and our definition does is it allows us to recognise what sessional academics are doing elsewhere. So if they're working in industry, for instance, our definition will ask them, there's an opportunity there for them to reflect on what they're doing. And if it meets our definition, they can actually report against that. And so they can, when they're recording their scholarship, we can see that, this is the broad input to our teaching quality. So so also having the program scholarship objectives as a sort of overarching goal, we can ask sessional teachers, academics, when we engage them, how does your scholarship contribute to our objectives? So that could also be another way in which we're when we're making the decision of who is the best sessional person for a given teaching role, what are they doing that supports our overall scholarship objectives? So that's how we're sort of approaching it. I mean, we're still working through that, and we recognise that we really want to work with our sessional teachers as much as possible, giving them opportunities to participate in the sorts of things that Vanessa was talking about before, which is, the seminars, the working alongside ongoing staff, on projects, that sort of thing. So we're trying to create those opportunities as well.
And that linked to people who spend most of their time in industry and offer sessional expertise as a second role that they play. That's a very important link in this conversation. Thank you very much, Fiona. Sally, any reflections from you on where we're up to at the moment?
So just quickly on that, watching the time as well. So I think we heard from both Melanie and Fiona about harnessing the evidence of impact to embed in that quality assurance way around course monitoring, enhancement and review, which just makes sense, of course. It goes to embedded practice and to a culture of continuous evidence-based improvement. And that's really what we're talking about, developing an evidence base and a research base that informs better practice, which is, again, is just, it's not rocket science, it's what normal people do. So, there's no reason why we couldn't do it in educational institutions as well. It also makes me think about impact as evaluation, and how what we do in our day jobs around learning and teaching and using our discipline expertise, and when we plan those activities, if we just thought as we should when planning new areas for examination, thought about how we're going to evaluate that as we go through. So you plan the evaluation at the beginning of the new teaching period. Randy Bass, American, as you may have gathered from his name, talked about how wonderful it is to have a problem in teaching, because the problem has always been, it's great to have a problem in research because, you know, yay, you didn't get to investigate everything. A problem in teaching is usually an indictment that something's going wrong. But if we problematize teaching positively and think about examining it as we're playing it out and then iteratively enhancing, then better for the sector, for the staff and its students. So all good, embedding, evaluating, impact. I think they're all speaking to the same song sheet around scholarship, and you know, special marks, I think, for ensuring that sessional staff are included, because they're so greatly an important part of our teaching remit, and particularly in TAFE when they bring that practice-based perspective. And of course, when you're investigating the efficacy of your teaching and learning practices and whether you are contemporary, who better to comment on that and involve in that conversation than the practice-based experts?
Thanks, Sally. Vanessa, I'm now going to ask you to just dig deep into the associate degree in engineering that you offer through TAFE Queensland. What constitutes scholarly activity in the field of engineering?
Yeah, well, generally, and I'll talk about both things on, you know, our reporting generally, but also some of the activities and how they report through. We do have an internal system that does capture the entire professional journey, including specific reporting of the scholarly activity of our higher ed delivery staff. It's not perfect, but it does certainly provide a centralised repository, I guess, for the evidencing of this scholarly activity. So some of the scholarly activities that specifically we've seen in our civil engineering team really is heavily focusing on the engagement with industry. Obviously, it's a part of the sector that is really subject to emerging technologies. They do change rapidly. So, you know, some of those examples is we have staff who have engaged in extra training in BIM, so building information modelling. I'm clearly not an engineer. And the use of VR examples. So some of the technologies they've embedded as pilots has been quite extraordinary. And often that's, you know, personal interest, but also professional capabilities that can be brought back into the team. So from that point, staff then have been running some regular praxis sessions within their discipline teams to work through what they've learned. So then that helps to inform any updates to assessment design, different approaches to teaching and learning as a result of those technologies, or even how to embed those technologies throughout the curriculum and the course. So there's also small groups of educators who have now attained specialisations in some of those areas, including BIM. So they do provide some in-house training to the other staff in the discipline space. And we're sort of looking at that as a positive way to impact on teaching and learning across the staff teaching, and particularly civil engineering. We also do have civil engineering staff who have published research, and they do present at peer-reviewed conferences. So then they deliver that internally as well, not just at external conferences. We sort of look at individual and collaborative scholarly activity is really important. And that's why, you know, and that goes back to what the other panelists have also said, that it's not just individual. It is a community involvement, and it also has to be shared at the institute level. Some of the evidence within our internal reporting system, you know, we call them artifacts. You've got to love the terminology, but they can include things such as the minutes of meetings that they've held, notes, diary notes from those hallway conversations, training session materials, reviews of the pilots of the technology that they've utilised and how that's informed curriculum design. Any praxis sessions can be uploaded into our internal reporting processes. And that then links back to those annual professional planning and development conversations that they have with their managers, because that helps to identify, I guess, their future needs, but also identify and discuss what they've engaged in and the impacts that has had on their teaching and learning. So then annually, all higher education staff, delivery staff, have to run a report from our internal reporting system, which is a higher education scholarly activity report, and that's then presented through our academic governance committees. As a result of some of that, that can lead through to some further actions to help inform and encourage and engage. So some of those processes we're still working on some internal improvements, but yeah, it does centralise some of that evidence gathering, which can be unique to each of our discipline areas.
Thanks, Vanessa. For panelists, we're now going to look at a couple of questions that have come up on the Q&A. So I'm going to digress from our flow of conversation, and I'm going to ask Melanie to comment in a second on the question that's been asked around how do you involve non-teaching staff in the scholarship of teaching and learning. But I'm firstly going to turn to you, Sally, if you would, to comment on the question that's been raised about what might be happening on the international stage, if you're aware from your wider understanding. Maybe just pick one country. Is there anything there that you think would fit into this conversation? And then we'll turn to Melanie. Thank you.
So thank you for that, Jenny. I'll try and find the question. Varied degree of scholarship leading the way on the international stage. So I suppose my observation would be, as we become, and this might not seem the obvious take, but as we become more professional in our learning and teaching practice, and TAFE might find that interesting from an observation from a higher education person, but that's essentially where we are. And as we're required and in a very competitive environment where employers and governments and the public have legitimate expectations of the output of our graduate outputs and the quality of our graduates, this movement towards embracing the scholarship of learning and teaching, or teaching and learning, has just grown exponentially internationally. That probably wasn't the case when I'm quite old. When I began my career, I had to explain to a promotion panel what I thought I was doing when I was doing learning and teaching investigation, and why wasn't I doing, how was that different in any way from teaching, and where were my research outputs? And, the obvious answer, this is research into teaching and learning, sort of became the start of the conversation. And the conversation has progressed since then. And now you see in the Texas standards this expectation that teachers, and it might seem trite, but the expectation is set out explicitly that teachers are supposed to have some expertise in teaching. It's not a novel conception. So internationally, that's where everyone is at. And there are whole conferences now dedicated to the scholarship of teaching and learning. It's an expectation, particularly in an increasingly regulated environment, that this is the case. And as we move into this next world of life, and I'm sorry, I realised that, Jenny, we had this conversation recently in another venue about lifelong learning having been around for decades, which I completely agree with, but there's the emphasis and the shift in government rhetoric has changed around that, I think. So lifelong learning, upskilling and reskilling has become even more important. So more of a focus on what's the return of investment in educational provision, broadly, nationally and internationally, and everyone's looking at that and looking at our educational providers to do a better job. So it was a long-winded way of saying it's embedded now in Australia, which replicates what's happening in the rest of the world, and there is an acceptance that this is a legitimate form of inquiry in higher education, which might surprise some TAFE colleagues.
Thank you very much, Sally. Melanie, over to you.
Yes, so far I've just been talking about the requirements around our academic staff, but of course we're dual sector, as are other TAFEs, particularly in Victoria. And so our scholarship, both vet teaching staff are also invited and supported to participate in scholarship, and they do. But it's not only confined to teaching staff. So, for example, our learning advisors have researched their practice around supporting teaching and produced publications in that area. My role is a cross-institutional one, so it's about leading and supporting scholarship right across the institution. In another example, a couple of years ago, we produced a book written, I think, involved about 25 staff across the institution, and there were both higher education and vocational education teachers and non-teaching staff, and in a number of cases around producing book chapters, a number of those cases there were collaborations, but where a higher ed person would team up with the VET person who perhaps was less experienced and or a non-teaching person and write those chapters. So yes, scholarship is very much encouraged and open to all right across.
Thank you, Melanie. 2 more questions have been put into our Q&A, and panelists, you're able to type an answer. And Vanessa, I'm going to direct you to respond to maybe Karen's question that's been put up there. It's the 4th question, which is around ethics. And I'm sure others will appreciate your response as well, because they should be able to see that. Fiona, I'm going to direct the last question that's there from Ben to you. Are much of these scholarly activities blossoming out into publications and the conference circuit? If so, from other TAFE's perspectives, where might they be able to engage with these, if that's possible for you to comment on? And then we will wind back to Sally to conclude our panel today. Thank you, Fiona.
Yes, well, our the scholarship that our staff do will often, if it's the sort of activity that is research, is considered research, because we see scholarship as a broad umbrella. So traditional research is in there, non-traditional research outputs, and then what we, I suppose, as a sort of subset of non-traditional outputs is the benchmarking, the scholarly course development, that sort of thing as well. So you would expect, people are publishing in their disciplines and in the learning and teaching and scholarship of learning and teaching publications and conferences and that sort of thing as well. So you will see higher education TAFE staff publishing. In terms of this, I'm not sure if the question was talking about the system around what we're doing. I think that's the intention, is to get our approach out there more, and I think that's why a seminar like this is so useful, and I think it gives us opportunity to sort of compare and contrast a bit more as well within the sector. So that's I think that's coming. I think in terms of actually characterising a bit more, and I know Melanie's done some work in this area too, published in this area, but I think we've got, I think we're picking up on Sally's point from before, we've got actually a really excellent impetus to share something quite unique about how we do this, and it would be of value to the universities as well, I think, and actually, because it's our focus, and I think we're doing it quite well from all the examples that I'm aware of, and especially from the comments today.
Fiona, thank you very much. TAFE colleagues, I'm going to ask you to pick up, and if you're happy, to type a response to Nancy's question, which is, I think it's about the last question on the Q&A, which is about colleagues in our sector who are delivering in both VET and higher education. While you're doing that, Sally, I'm going to turn to you for the very last question in terms of our seminar this afternoon, which is, as a final reflection point, Sally, why should TAFE colleagues engage in scholarship and scholarly activities?
Which I suppose I would say, why would they not? For me, it's a matter of professional pride. I mean, you don't just go into, do the learning and teaching and assessment piece and engage with students and walk away from it. As something that's always sits there in your head and heart and the ethos of your being. I think advances in practice and empowering students and engaging students is really the day job. I got that from one of my equity colleagues very early in the day at Queensland University of Technology. This is our day job. You take professional pride in it. You want to do the best job you can. You have to examine your practice. There's no industry where you don't examine what you do on a regular basis with a view to iterating. I just would encourage everyone to do it. I've personally found it very intrinsically motivating, which I know now because I've done some reading in the scholarship of mental health and wellbeing. is it goes to your mental health and well-being. If you feel intrinsically motivated, you feel as though you have some autonomy and control over over what you're doing in your workplace, and you get that control and autonomy and a feeling of expertise by making sure that you are pedagogically informed and that you do constantly iterate and talk with colleagues. So the point about talking to non-teaching staff, or and I typed a bit of an answer in that because that's exactly what I spent all yesterday doing at a Melbourne university, talking with both academic and professional staff about the rich insights that they have, and then how we can iterate practice using all the data and the evidence that they have available to them.
I think we could have gone on for a lot longer. I think we've just touched on the edge of this conversation, but I do think we've captured the essence of what we were trying to do today, which is share 3 models to also have someone who's got very deep experience right across higher education and also has worked with TAFEs in this space as well, in Sally. And to all 4 of our panels, to Sally, to Vanessa, to Fiona and Melanie, thank you so much for your time. There has been a bit of preparation in this. We really appreciate that. And we hope that everybody who's participated today has taken something away that informs their practice, because this was what today was all about. Thank you all. That's it from TAFE Talks for our July webinar. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.